That was something that I wanted, because ultimately the film was to be shown in the rest of India. It was really an introduction to go out for the rest of India.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, who didn't know very much about it, and so it served its purpose, I think.
Now, if you just rewind back in time, what are your earliest memories of watching films, and at which point did you decide that I want to become a filmmaker?
Oh, but to become a filmmaker, that was when I was very young, when I must have been about 6 or 7.
Was Gurudat also an influence?
Yes, well, Gurudat influenced me in the sense that he crystallized in me my ambition, because he was the first person in our extended family who became a filmmaker. And he'd become a filmmaker when I was about 14, 15. And when I saw him succeed, then I became confident that I can, in fact, think of becoming a filmmaker. Otherwise, you see, where I come from, Hyderabad, there was no such thing as a film industry there. And if anybody said that you wanted to become a filmmaker, then you seemed like you'd gone off your rocker, you know, that you were not quite sane. But because there was an example there, the family also didn't object. But they all felt a little worried on my account, saying that suppose he doesn't succeed, how will he make a living, all that sort of thing. You know, that happens to any family.
You spent a lot of time making ad films before that, before you ventured into making
In my entire training of filmmaking, I didn't go to a film school. So had to be somewhere when I had to learn. And my learning was entirely by making advertising films. You see, the great advantage of making advertising films was that, first of all, storytelling, you know, you have great compactness in the manner in which you tell your story. So you learn economy in terms of the use of the language of cinema. And then you also get a much stronger grounding in the grammar of film. Now, all those things helped, and then, of course, I made hundreds of advertising films. So I was shooting practically more than 180 days a year. So by the time I finished my career in advertising, I was not only familiar with equipment, cameras, lenses, lights, everything. So when I went into my first feature, I was not somebody like a lot of young people who, when they make their first feature, they are absolutely new to cinema itself. So mine wasn't a situation like that, because I had already been making films and also documentaries. So when I made my first feature, Ankur, it was, I mean, it wasn't as though it was my first film in that sense. Yes. It was my first feature film. Yes.
Tell us how Ankur happened, but I mean, the film was also very offbeat as far as the subject is concerned, as far as the cast is concerned. So it was a big leap of sorts at the time.
Well, you see, I never saw it as a big leap, but anyway, the fact was that when I was in college, this was based on certain incidents and events that took place, to which I was a witness. And it took place in a kind of little village close to where we used to stay, a little hamlet, as it were. And we had, you know, the person, the young man in the story, happened to be somebody I knew. So it was in that sense slightly biographical of that young man. And then, of course, I built up the story while I was still a student in college. And that was the first film I wanted to make, and eventually became the first feature film I made. But it took me a long time. It took me about 12 years from the time I started, you know, came out of college. So I didn't make a film when I was in my 20s, as I would have loved to.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen that way. So I made it much later, 12 years after I'd finished my college education. And that's how the film came out. But you see, fortunately for me, the film was very successful, both commercially as well as critically. And also it made stars out of 3 people in the film. And that was something that worked out well for me. And then I became a director as well, who was recognized. You see, so then after that, it was not a question of how, but when I was going to be making films.
Ankur was made in 74, Nishant came in 75. During that time, the kind of films that were made were different, the commercial films.
Well,
so did the
clearly-
success of it surprise you? I mean, Ankur went
No,
for...
you see, because one knew what was happening. See, one of the things that had happened in the mid-70s is that, you see, the television was emerging. Television had come into Bombay in 1970,
Late 70s.
thereabouts. And so what was happening was that the audiences were being lost to the cinema. The television was taking quite a number, I mean, slicing off the audience of cinema.
Theatres, yeah.
And therefore, cinemas were slightly crisis-ridden. And it was a time when there was also a lot of room for films, film time. You had enough film time for different kinds of films to come. And that was the time when I started making films, so that it was easy to get cinemas at that time. And fortunately for me, my distributor happened to be the biggest film advertising distributor. So he could get cinemas at will and choose his cinemas well. So you had that kind of an advantage, which a lot of other young filmmakers did not have at that time. So that was fortunate for me. And it became quite easy after that to make film after film after film. So through the 70s, I was often making more than one film a year, into the 80s. It's only after that that it started to become more and more difficult, because cinema would not take, because the big cinemas became very expensive
To rent out.
for films, because the rentals had gone up. And it's when the multiplexes started to come, then again you had a different kind of cinema being produced. Like, say, for instance, on the present lot of young filmmakers, Dibakar Banerjee, Anurag Kashyap, Motwani and all these people, they came into films successfully, also helped by the multiplexes.
Absolutely.
Otherwise you had a dip. I come from generation of 1970s, and with me there were a number of filmmakers. By the 80s, it was slowly trailing off, into the 90s. 90s was a difficult decade.
Yes.
Then again, it started to go up.
Another question. Nowadays, this concept of crowdsourcing has become quite common. A lot of crowdsourced films are being made. But you made a crowdsourced film almost 40 years back in the form of Manthan.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
There again, I was lucky. You see, the point was that when Manthan was made, one of the things was I had made it for Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation, which is Dr. Kurian. And I had made 2 documentaries for him. And I had told him also that, this story that I'm telling in documentary is not likely to reach a very large audience. It's going to reach mostly people who are already
Familiar with it?
yes, I mean, they don't need to be persuaded. They are already persuaded people. So the thing is to make a film that goes to the general audiences, where they see cooperative milk cooperatives can work, and also it's part of a certain developmental scheme which is practical for India. And he said, fine, but I said, money. He said, let me see, I'll try and get the money from all the members of the Gujarat cooperatives, which he did. And it was quite simple that way, because he had a whole machinery available, the Amul people.
Yeah.
There was a whole machinery available to collect milk twice a day, every day, from every farmer. And so it was just a question of persuading them to let go of 2 rupees.
2 rupees each.
And that was it, and we made the film.
So how many people contributed roughly around?
Obviously, there were 5 million people.
So that was quite... Now you made
No,
lots of...
500,000, sorry, not 5 million, 500,000 people, which meant that ₹1 million was available.
Great. You made lots of documentaries as well as features. Which ones do you prefer? Documentaries or features?
Well, you see, once I started making fiction films, then that became my main mode of communication. Advertising films I gave up because I found that to make good advertising films, you have to be very young. It's a young person's medium of operation.
Yeah.
Older people, you start to feel, you don't feel A, satisfied by doing it, and B, what happens is you get very impatient, making a film simply to sell a product or a service.
Yeah.
So it's something you start with, but you don't carry on forever with it. That's how I personally feel.
Okay. Another question that I had is, barring you yourself, I don't see too many filmmakers in India, especially Hindi cinema, who've had a successful career over a 15 or 20 year period time. They all had their highs and then they had lows. One, why do you think is the reason? And two, why have you been so successful on that?
Well, it's difficult to tell. You see, one of the things is that you have to move with the times. As long as you must have your commitment and conviction in terms of ideas and approaches to life and, your own way of looking at the world and so on. Your worldview has to be kept. But having kept that, you should be able to deal with the manner in which communications change from generation to generation. How do you attract younger people? Now that sort of thing. Now I think you have to keep your ear to the ground, and it's only then can you move to some extent with time. I don't think that everybody is totally successful, but to some extent you are. You see, it's kept me above water because I started making my features in 1973. That's a long time ago. Yes. So yeah, I managed to carry on. And of course I do other things also. I work for television, I do different kinds of filmmaking and different formats as well. But primarily, of course, for me, the most satisfying thing is to make a feature film.
Right, and one last question. You've already given Indian cinema so much. What more can we expect from you?
Well, I've got a couple of features that I want to make, but of course I just recently finished a 10-hour television series called Samvidhan on the making of the Indian Constitution. Now after that I'm doing a 90-minute film on the history of Punjab, and following that I'll be going back to do a feature.
Well, we wish you all the best for that. Thank you so much for talking to us. Well, that was Mr. Shyam Benegal, the living legend, here with us in our studios. Well, that was a program called Gazali. Keep watching Prudent Media. Till we meet again, it's goodbye from us.